January 1st, 1863, midnight. Dear Diary, today I signed the Emancipation Proclamation freeing millions. Tonight, a man I watched die 5 years ago knocked on my door and told me I'd made a terrible mistake. The day had been extraordinary. After months of political maneuvering, moral wrestling, and strategic calculation, I'd finally signed the document that would change America forever. With a stroke of my pen, I declared that all slaves in Confederate territory were now free. Mary had been radiant at the signing ceremony. "You've done it, Abraham. You've finally done what we always knew was right." But as I sat in my study that night, reviewing the document one more time, I felt an unease I couldn't explain. Something about the political ease with which certain groups had supported the proclamation troubled me. That's when I heard the tapping at my window, 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. It was a signal I hadn't heard in 5 years. A signal from the Underground Railroad, used by conductors to identify themselves to safe houses. But why would anyone use it on the White House? I moved to the window cautiously. In the darkness outside, I could barely make out a figure, tall, thin, with the posture of someone who'd spent years carrying heavy loads. As he moved closer to the lamplight, I saw his face clearly, and my blood ran cold. It was Samuel, the same Samuel who'd convinced me not to resign during my darkest hour. The same Samuel whose words had given me strength when I needed it most. The same Samuel whose funeral I'd attended in 1858. I opened the window. "Samuel? But you died. Yellow fever. I was at your funeral." "You were at a funeral, Mr. President," he said quietly. "But it wasn't mine. Please, I need to speak with you. What I have to tell you can't wait until morning." Against every instinct of caution, I let him in. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of the day. Perhaps it was the haunting familiarity of his voice. Or perhaps I needed to understand how a dead man had come back to life. Samuel sat in my study, looking older than he should despite being supposedly dead for 5 years. His hands trembled as he accepted a glass of water. "Mr. Lincoln, I need to tell you about something that's been happening in the shadows while you fought this war. Something about the abolition movement that you need to understand before the proclamation takes effect." "What about the abolition movement?" "It's been compromised. Not all of it, not even most of it. But certain key figures, certain influential voices, they're not working to free slaves. They're working to control what happens after slaves are freed." I leaned back in my chair. After fighting the foundation, after discovering centuries of manipulation, I'd hoped I was done with conspiracies. But something in Samuel's eyes told me this was different, more personal, more immediate. "Explain," I said simply. 5 years ago, I was working with the Underground Railroad, helping slaves escape to freedom. I'd personally guided over 300 people to the North. Then I stumbled onto something. Meetings between prominent abolitionists and Southern plantation owners. Secret meetings where they discussed managing the transition and controlling the freed population. Abolitionists meeting with slave owners. It seemed impossible. Not just meeting with them, Samuel continued. Planning with them. And what they were planning was worse than slavery itself. He pulled out a worn notebook from inside his coat. "This contains notes from meetings I infiltrated over 5 years. What I learned was horrifying. There's a group, they call themselves the Transition Council, made up of Northern industrialists, Southern planters, and abolition movement leaders. That's impossible. Abolitionists would never work with slave owners. Not openly. But Mr. President, think about what happens after emancipation. 4 million people, suddenly free, with no money, no land, no education, no resources. What happens to them?" I'd thought about this, of course. But the immediate moral imperative of ending slavery had overshadowed the complex questions of what came next. Samuel was right to press the issue. "The Transition Council has a plan," Samuel continued, his voice grim. "They support emancipation publicly. But privately, they're preparing a system that will be slavery in everything but name. Sharecropping arrangements that trap freed slaves in debt. Labor contracts that bind them to former masters. Laws that criminalize unemployment, allowing freed slaves to be arrested and forced into convict labor. They want to control the freed population," I said, understanding dawning. "Keep them dependent, exploitable, just under a different legal framework." "Exactly. They've been preparing this for years. The Civil War created perfect conditions: chaos, economic disruption, social upheaval. In that chaos, They can implement their system before anyone realizes what's happening. And they thought you discovered too much. Samuel nodded. They tried to kill me, made it look like yellow fever. But I survived, went into hiding, and have been documenting their operations ever since. I stayed hidden because I needed to understand the full scope of their plan before revealing myself. So you let everyone think you were dead. Your family, your friends, everyone who loved you. Pain crossed Samuel's face. The hardest thing I've ever done. But if the Transition Council had known I survived, they would have tried again. And next time, they might have targeted my family to ensure my silence. He opened the notebook, showing me pages of careful handwriting. Names, dates, meeting locations, financial transactions. It was evidence of a conspiracy that spanned both North and South, that crossed battle lines and political divisions. Who are the leaders of this council? I asked. Samuel's answer made my stomach turn. People you trust, Mr. President. People who advised you on the Emancipation Proclamation itself. He showed me a list of names. I recognized several immediately, prominent abolitionists who'd been pushing me to sign the proclamation. Men I'd considered allies in the fight against slavery. These people have been giving you advice designed to shape emancipation in ways that serve their interests, Samuel explained. They want you to free the slaves, yes, but they also want you to do it in a way that leaves freed slaves vulnerable, exploitable, controllable. How? By freeing slaves without giving them land, without education, without economic resources. By creating a situation where freed people have no choice but to work for their former masters under slightly different terms. By making freedom legal but not practical. It was a devastating critique. I'd thought the Emancipation Proclamation was a purely moral act, a step toward justice. But Samuel was suggesting that without careful follow-through, it could become a tool for a different kind of exploitation. What would you have me do differently? I asked. The proclamation is signed. That can't be changed. But what comes next? That's still under your control. You need to push for land redistribution, for education, for economic opportunities that give freed slaves real independence. You need to resist the Transition Council's influence. And if I do that, they'll fight me? They're already fighting you, Mr. President. They just haven't revealed themselves yet. They're waiting to see which direction you take emancipation. If you follow their advice, they'll support you. If you deviate, they'll work to undermine you. I thought about my cabinet, my advisors, the abolition movement leaders I'd been working with. How many were genuine? How many were part of this Transition Council? How could I tell the difference between someone who wanted true freedom and someone who wanted controlled freedom? I need proof, I said. Real, undeniable proof that this council exists and is planning what you say. I can get you proof. But Mr. President, you need to understand. Going after the Transition Council means fighting people who appear to be your allies. It means questioning the motives of abolitionists, of people who fought alongside you against slavery. It also means doing what's right instead of what's convenient. But then Samuel revealed something that made the conspiracy even more personal. There's something else you need to know. About your son, Willie. My heart stopped. What about Willie? The illness that killed him. I've been investigating, and I found communications suggesting the Transition Council had access to your household. They were monitoring your family, your decisions, looking for leverage. Are you saying they killed Willie? The same rage I'd felt learning about the Foundation's role in his death came flooding back. I'm saying they had the means and the motive. You were wavering on emancipation timing in early 1862. Willie got sick right after you met with several Transition Council members who were pushing you to delay the proclamation until they had their post-emancipation system in place. If Samuel was right, Willie's death hadn't been just tragic, it had been strategic. Another son murdered by people trying to manipulate my decisions. The thought filled me with a rage I could barely control. Who? I demanded. Which council members had access to my household? Samuel showed me another page from his notebook. 3 names, all people who'd visited the White House in late 1861 and early 1862. All abolition movement figures I trusted. I can't prove they deliberately infected Willie, Samuel cautioned. But they had opportunity, and their correspondence shows they discussed using family pressure to influence your timing on emancipation. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark Washington night. How many conspiracies was I supposed to fight? How many groups wanted to manipulate me, control my decisions, use my family as weapons against me? Mr. President, Samuel said quietly, I know you're tired. I know you've already fought secret wars that most people will never know about. But this one matters more than anything else you've done. Why? Because emancipation is either the beginning of real freedom or the beginning of a new kind of bondage. The Transition Council wants the latter. You're the only one with the power to ensure the former. He was right. The Emancipation Proclamation was just a piece of paper if I didn't follow through with policies that gave freed slaves real opportunities. And if the Transition Council was working to undermine those opportunities, I needed to stop them. What do you need from me? I asked. Access to your meetings with abolition leaders, to policy discussions about Reconstruction, to plans for what happens in southern states as Union forces retake them. I need to identify which advisors are genuine and which are council members. You want to spy on my own administration. I want to protect your administration from infiltration, just like you did when you fought the Foundation. This is the same war, Mr. President, just a different battlefield. But then we heard voices in the hallway. Mary was coming with someone I hadn't expected. The door opened, and Mary entered with a young black woman I didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 25, elegantly dressed despite the late hour, carrying herself with the bearing of someone educated and confident. Abraham, Mary said, this is Miss Elizabeth Keckley. She's been working with me on something related to Samuel's visit. Elizabeth Keckley. I knew the name, Mary's dressmaker, a former slave who'd bought her own freedom, who'd become successful and respected in Washington society. But what was she doing here at midnight? Mr. President, Elizabeth said, her voice cultured and precise. I apologize for the late intrusion. But Mrs. Lincoln and I have been coordinating with Samuel for the past 3 months. What he's told you tonight is true. I can verify it because I've been infiltrating the Transition Council myself. You've been. I looked at Mary. You knew about this. I knew Samuel was alive, Mary admitted. He contacted me 6 months ago. I've been helping him gather evidence while you focused on winning the war and preparing the proclamation. I didn't tell you because, well, after everything with the Foundation, I wanted to be sure this was real before adding another conspiracy to your burdens. My wife, running another intelligence operation without telling me. I should have been angry, but mostly I was impressed. And exhausted. What have you learned? I asked Elizabeth. The Transition Council operates through a network of seemingly legitimate businesses and charitable organizations. They're preparing freedmen's aid societies that will offer help to newly freed slaves. But that help comes with strings attached. Work contracts, debt arrangements, legal obligations that recreate slavery's control mechanisms. She pulled out documents from a folder she'd been carrying. These are draft contracts the council plans to offer freed slaves. They look generous on the surface: housing, food, work opportunities. But read the fine print. I read through the contracts carefully. Elizabeth was right. They were traps. Freed slaves would be offered employment, housing, and supplies, but at inflated prices that ensured they'd always be in debt. The contracts included clauses allowing employers to discipline workers, to control their movement, to separate families if business needs required it. It was slavery with legal paperwork. How widespread is this? I asked. The council has been building this infrastructure for 5 years, Samuel said. They have networks in every major northern city and connections to planters throughout the South. When emancipation takes effect, they'll be the primary organizations offering help to freed slaves. And freed slaves, desperate for work and shelter, will sign these contracts without understanding what they're agreeing to. I said, seeing the trap clearly. Exactly. Within a year of emancipation, the council estimates they'll have over 1 million freed slaves locked into these arrangements. They'll control housing, employment, education, even movement between regions. Slavery in everything but name. But then Elizabeth revealed the most shocking part of the conspiracy. Mr. President, the Transition Council isn't working alone. They have financial backing from European interests, the same banking houses that funded both sides of this war. They see freed slaves as a new source of cheap, controllable labor that can be exploited more efficiently than slavery because it has legal legitimacy. The Foundation, I said, recognition dawning. They're connected to the Foundation. Not directly, Samuel clarified. But they're using similar methods, similar funding sources, similar manipulation tactics. The Transition Council emerged from the same networks of control that the Foundation represented. So even after defeating the Foundation's American operations, the systems they'd built remained. The networks of financial control, political manipulation, and human exploitation continued under different names with different goals. I sank into my chair. When does it end? When do I get to simply govern instead of fighting shadow wars against people trying to control humanity? It doesn't end, Mary said gently. Not as long as there are people who profit from exploitation. But Abraham, you don't have to fight alone. Samuel has been building a network of freed slaves, escaped slaves, and genuine abolitionists who understand what's at stake. Elizabeth has connections throughout Washington society. I have my intelligence operations. Together, we can counter the Transition Council. How? By exposing them before they can implement their system, Elizabeth said. By creating alternative organizations that offer real help to freed slaves without the controlling contracts. By pushing for policies that give freed people land, education, and economic independence. Samuel opened his notebook to a marked page. The council has a major meeting scheduled for January 15th. All their key members will be there, finalizing plans for implementing their post-emancipation system. If we can document that meeting, record what they're planning, we'd have evidence to expose them publicly. Where's the meeting? Philadelphia. At a private club that presents itself as a charitable organization for helping former slaves. The irony isn't lost on me. And you want me to? I trailed off, realizing what they were suggesting. You want me to infiltrate the meeting? The President of the United States, sneaking into a secret conspiracy meeting in Philadelphia. Not you personally, Mary said quickly, but someone you trust, with authority to act on what they discover. Maybe General Grant, maybe. I'll go, I interrupted. I've done it before with the Foundation. I can do it again. Abraham, you can't keep personally investigating every conspiracy, Mary protested. Yes, I can. Because these conspiracies keep targeting what I care about most. Willie, emancipation, the future of millions of people. I can't delegate fighting for that. Samuel looked at me with something like respect. You're not like other presidents, Mr. Lincoln. Most would send others to take the risks. You insist on taking them yourself. Because I have to live with the consequences of success or failure. I need to see the truth with my own eyes. But Elizabeth then revealed a complication that would make infiltration much more dangerous. Mr. President, there's something you need to understand about the January 15th meeting. It's not just planning sessions. The Transition Council is expecting a special guest, Jefferson Davis. I stared at her. The Confederate president is meeting with Northern abolitionists. With people who present themselves as Northern abolitionists, Samuel corrected. The council has members on both sides. They don't care who wins the war as long as they control what happens to freed slaves afterward. Davis knows about the council? We don't think so. They're approaching him with a proposition, Confederate cooperation in managing freed slaves in exchange for lenient Reconstruction terms. They're going to present it as a way to preserve Southern economic interests while accepting emancipation. The layers of manipulation were staggering. The Transition Council was trying to play both sides, offering Confederates a way to maintain economic control even after losing the war, while offering Union interests a source of cheap labor to fuel Northern industries. If Davis accepts their proposition, I trailed off, seeing the implications. Then the war ends with slavery legally abolished, but practically continuing. Elizabeth finished. The Transition Council brokers a peace deal where both sides get what the council wants them to have, continued exploitation of black labor under new legal frameworks. I can't let that happen. Then you need to be at that meeting, Samuel said. You need to see what they're proposing, understand how they're manipulating both sides, and find a way to expose them before Davis accepts their terms. How do I infiltrate a meeting where the Confederate president will be present? He knows what I look like. We've been planning for that, Mary said. Elizabeth has connections to the household staff at the meeting location. We can get you in through service entrances, position you where you can observe without being observed. And if I'm discovered, then you're the President of the United States caught spying on a meeting between your own citizens and the Confederate president, Samuel said bluntly. The political fallout would be devastating. The Transition Council would spin it as paranoid government overreach. Your credibility would be destroyed. So the usual situation, risk everything for the truth, or play it safe and let manipulation continue unopened. I'll go, I said firmly. But I need to understand more about how the council operates. who their key members are, what weaknesses they have that we can exploit. Over the next hour, Samuel, Elizabeth, and Mary briefed me on everything they'd learned about the Transition Council, the financial networks, the political connections, the propaganda operations they'd built to shape public opinion about what freed slaves deserved and what they could handle. It was sophisticated, well-funded, and frighteningly effective. They'd been building this infrastructure while I'd been focused on winning the war and preparing emancipation. They'd anticipated my moves and positioned themselves to control the outcome. But they'd made one mistake. They'd underestimated the freed slaves themselves. They'd assumed that people who'd lived in bondage would be passive, grateful for any help, willing to accept whatever terms were offered. They hadn't accounted for people like Samuel and Elizabeth, who understood what real freedom required and were willing to fight for it. January 2nd, 1863, dawn. Dear Diary, I signed the Emancipation Proclamation yesterday, thinking I was ending slavery. Tonight, I learned I might have simply changed its form unless I'm vigilant about what comes next. Samuel is alive. That alone would be shocking enough. But what he's revealed about the Transition Council, about the conspiracy to control freed slaves even after emancipation, about the possible murder of Willie, it's almost too much to process. Mary has been running another secret operation, just like during the Foundation crisis. I should be angry that she kept this from me. Instead, I'm grateful that she understood the burden I was carrying and tried to shoulder some of it herself. Elizabeth Keckley represents something the Transition Council hasn't anticipated: freed slaves who are educated, successful, and politically sophisticated enough to recognize manipulation when they see it. If there are more like her, if freed slaves organize themselves instead of waiting to be helped by white saviors, the Council's plans might fail on their own. But I can't rely on that. I need to actively fight the Transition Council, expose their operations, and create policies that give freed slaves real independence rather than new forms of bondage. 14 days until the Philadelphia meeting. 14 days to prepare for an infiltration that could expose the conspiracy or destroy my presidency. 14 days to figure out how to fight people who appear to be my allies while actually being enemies of everything I'm trying to accomplish. The candle burns low as dawn approaches. In a few hours, I need to attend meetings, make decisions, act like a normal president dealing with normal problems. But nothing about this war has been normal. And freeing 4 million people is just the beginning of what will be the hardest fight of all, ensuring that freedom means something real. Tomorrow, the real work begins. But preparing for the Philadelphia infiltration would reveal an even deeper betrayal. Someone in my own cabinet was already working with the Transition Council, and they knew I was planning to attend their meeting.